Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good. Okay. My name is Ted Pacek. I am director of the Ali Al Naimi Upstream Petroleum Engineering Research Center. And I have the honor of introducing my old friend, Professor Nate Hagens. Nate is an old, mostly virtual friend of mine and a great community organizer. Most recently, we've been communicating on his email forum, Sasquatch Jedi, or in translation, Bigfoot Jedi, which is an egalitarian tribe of some 20 prominent and unruly scientists, engineers, writers, and philosophers around the world. He holds a master's degree in finance from the University of Chicago. In those of you who are not American may know that it's one of the best business schools in America, and a PhD in natural resources from the University of Vermont. Previously, Nate was president of Sanctuary Asset Management and vice president at the investment firms Salomon Brothers and Lehman Brothers. Then he saw the light and became a professor at the University of Minnesota, where he now teaches a super hot class, Reality 101, whose echoes you will see among his 168 slides or so that he's going to show you. So I need to stay brief. I could tell you many things about Nate, but since many of you are students, I went to the Rate My Professors website, which is usually used by students to trash their teachers. And there, Nate has a rating of 4.7 out of 5, which is unreasonably high. Here is one quote. Nate is a phenomenal professor, and Reality 101 changed my entire perspective and career path. This class should be required for all college students. What I've learned is really outstanding and so influential. And by the way, the dean of the college where Nate is teaching this class sat in the class and will require it for all students in the college, and perhaps later for all students at the university. Nate has appeared on PBS, BBC, ABC, NPR, and so on, and lectured around the world. He is currently on the boards of Post-Carbon Institute in California, Bottleneck Foundation, Institute for Integrated Economic Research in France, and the Institute for the Study of Energy and Future. I think I'll stop here because I don't want to cut to his time. I'll give a complimentary lecture tomorrow between 2 and 3 in Building 9, so if you hated what Nate will say, you're going to hate my lecture even more. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to our host. Salam alaikum. So I, as Tad said, have 160 slides. Hearing some of the presentations earlier this week and listening to the conversations, this presentation is going to be a little bit of a black sheep. Every time I do a talk like this, especially to young people, I realize it's a little bit of a sledgehammer, and I kind of feel bad. And the hours before the talk, I remove some slides, but it's so important that people understand the whole picture that I didn't remove any slides, and so I'm going to do the full fire hydrant, as it were. So the talk is going to have a brief introduction, then I'm going to go through 7 energy and economy basics. I'm going to explain why humans in the global market economy are functioning like a superorganism. I'm going to have some implications on what that means, and I'm going to conclude with some what-to-do suggestions. So, briefly, imagine a lion the size of a school bus that's purple with green iridescent dragonfly wings flying over the Red Sea and swooping down and picking up a snorkeler in a reef with its talons. So none of you have ever imagined that before, but by me saying those words, all of you pictured something like what I just described. And the problem is science, and most of you are scientists, is a very recent thing in our evolutionary trajectory, whereas language and imagery that would work in our ancestral past are very, very ancient. So what ends up happening is our virtual world in our minds imagines many, many more things than are possible in the physical world. And this is a problem with some of the stories that our culture is telling each other. Now, this is less prominent for scientists because you're trained to be skeptical and look at, can that be possible? But you're still human. So when we think about myths about the future, we have to recognize that our mind is susceptible to stories that sound great, but may not be feasible. So this talk, I think there is a trade-off between being really accurate and reductionist and precise and being relevant and having a wide scope. So most of the talks, I think, this week have been very interesting, relevant to a micro perspective of technology or a process or something like that. My talk is going to be less precise, less accurate, but in my opinion, more relevant and a framework for our societal situation. So we live in a time of paradox, a 12-year plateau in conventional oil production, yet price is only $60. There's widespread recognition of human-caused climate change, massive investments into renewable energy, but globally our CO2 is increasing at the highest rate in recorded history. For 90% of people in the developed world, growth in terms of income ended a decade ago, yet world stock markets are at all-time highs. Everyone seems worried about what's going on, but no one's talking about the real issues on TV. We're also in a time of myth. Demand for oil will dry up in the next 20 years due to self-driving Uber taxis. We'll begin manned space colonies by 2030. The global economy will be growing at 20% a year by 2060. We will grow economies, mitigate climate change, and solve poverty and inequality using solar, wind, and smart grid tech. And humans will be extinct in 10 years from climate change. There's all these myths that we hear. So in my opinion, before we address these things, it's a time for more urgent, more relevant questions. What should we be doing to meet the challenges of the future? In order to arrive at the appropriate answers, our first and critical task is to be asking the right questions. The London School of Economics, Queen Elizabeth questioned in 2008, why did no one foresee the timing, extent, and severity of the global financial crisis? The British Academy answered a year later, a psychology of denial gripped the financial and corporate world. It was a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people to understand the risks to the system as a whole. It's my opinion that you have to see the system as a whole for you to understand what's going on. And my class that Tad mentioned is neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, energy, resources, minerals, economy, money, climate change, mass extinction, all into one. And I'm going to give you a 1-hour summary of that class and the implications today. Okay, so let's get to some energy and economy basics. They are basic, but a lot of people don't know them, which is why I'm going to do about a 20-minute review here. So energy underpins natural systems and human economies. So if we think about nature, there's an energy expense and an energy income from every behavior of organisms in the wild. A cheetah will expend a certain amount of calories to catch an antelope. The higher the payoff in the calories that he eats versus the calories expended, the more options, the more benefits, the more adaptive it is for the organism. So in nature, there's something called a trophic cascade, where sunlight grows the grasshoppers eat the grass, the frogs eat the grasshoppers, the trout eat the frogs, and a human would eat a trout. 300 trout are needed to support one man for a year. The trout must consume 90,000 frogs that must consume 27 million grasshoppers that live off 1,000 tons of grass. This is a trophic pyramid. The same thing happens historically with human societies and in the present. Historically, we turned primary capital, resources, trees, sunlight, fish, into secondary capital, tools and ships, and also goods and services, beer and food. And then we had tertiary markers. In the old days, it used to be gold. And I'm going to get back to this later. But the central point is that energy also underpins human systems. And irrespective of technology, every single good and service in our economies first requires what? An energy input. No matter how you make a cup, whether you make it from a coconut or from plastic or aluminum or ceramic, you need an energy input to combine with materials to make that item. So GDP stands for gross domestic product. which is the sum total of goods and services, basically the income of a country. If you add up all the countries, you get the world. This is incredibly correlated with energy use. The red line here is GDP, and the light blue line on the bottom is primary energy. And from the 1970 to 2000, they started to decouple a little bit because we got more energy efficient at power plants and such. But since 2000 to now, there's been a very, very tight link between energy use and GDP. And if you use high quality energy, like electricity, the link is even tighter. Tad gave me this slide. This shows that the more energy a country uses, the higher their GDP is in general. Power consumption, energy per unit time on the bottom in a logarithmic scale, annual GDP per person on the left-hand axis, and you can see that there's a pretty tight correlation. The more energy used, the more GDP you have on balance. Okay, number 2, fossil sunlight underpins modern economies. Some of you in the room might recognize these as diatoms, which are the majority of ocean plankton, which between 10 and hundreds of millions of years ago sank to the bottom of the ocean, were compressed in geologic time and heat, and a couple hundred years ago, we found them out to be coal, oil, and natural gas, and have been accessing them to power our economies. So this is a picture of me. And last night I changed this since I've put on like 20 pounds since the last kind I'm now 1/7 of a horse. And that is my horse, which is 1 horse. And that's my utility vehicle, which is 45 horsepower, the equivalent of 45 horses. And that's my truck. My truck, if you could have a couple of these in my truck, you could push that truck up a road in a mountain in the snow for many, many miles. Can you imagine how much work a human would have to be, or 10 humans, to do that? So 1 barrel of oil has 5.7 million British thermal units of energy, which translates to 1,760 kilowatt hours of energy, which converted to work, because there's heat loss, is around 700 kilowatt hours. A human working for 9 hours a day generates 6/10 of 1 kilowatt hour of work. So 1 barrel of oil, which we now pay $60 for, does 4.5 years of my work. Okay? So the average human laborer today makes $57 a day. Now, the average, how many man days of work can you get from the average global daily wage of $57? Well, 1. You can get 1 day of work for $57. The average American, you can only get 1/5 of a day of work, because the average American salary is almost 5 times what the world average is. But oil at $80 per barrel gives us 6,000 man days of work. Oil at its historical average of $20 a barrel gives us almost 22,000 man days of work. Very few people know this. Oil is, on human timescales, virtually indistinguishable from magic. Number 3, industrialization is the result of massive inputs of low-cost fossil labor. So a couple hundred years ago, we started applying large amounts of this incredibly powerful, incredibly cheap material to our economies, energy. But we did is, energy from fossil fuels is very inefficient in our technology, much less efficient than human work. But since it's so cheap, we would add thousands or tens of thousands of units of fossil labor to replace what humans used to do by themselves. So imagine this. Where I live, we milk cows a lot. It's a dairy state. So in the old days, we used to milk cows by hand. No external energy use. That would result, because you have to spend 30 minutes per cow, a profit or a wage of $5 an hour. Then we had these semi-automatic milking machines where the cows, my big ears got in the way. I'll keep talking while he comes and adjusts this. So the semi-automated parlor uses 180 times more energy because of the embedded energy and the electricity. And then the fully automated milking machine, the cow just walks up there and gets things attached to it and it gets milked. Only 1 or 2 minutes per human input to do that. Thank you. That uses 400 times the energy. Now, what ends up happening is we add so much of this cheap fossil energy that the wage goes from $5 to $20 in the intermediate stage, and the wage goes from $20 to $25 when we add more and more cheap energy. So this is kind of a story of industrialization. Now, that $25 of wages could be cheaper milk. It could be more profits to the factory owner. It could be higher wages to the employee. So this cheap fossil energy, increased wages, increased profits, lowered the price of goods, and probably increased the number of people on the planet. So at over 210,000 kilocalories a day, the average person in the USA, or KSA, has the metabolic equivalent of a 30-ton animal. And this translates into what? Into benefits to human societies. So I show America here. America right now has 49 times the income that the average human on the planet did 200 years ago. The world today has 13.7 times the income, adjusted for inflation, than the average human did 200 years ago. That's because of our fossil helpers. Oil, coal, and natural gas are doing 99.5% of the physical work on our planet. Human labor is only doing 0.5%. But what ends up happening is if prices go up, sorry for the labeling, if prices go up, these benefits dissipate. So if you look at the blue was the original graph, that's 5 cents a kilowatt hour. If you look at the orange, it doesn't really impact the intermediate stage, but on the very energy-intensive process, your profits decline dramatically. And if you triple the price from 5 cents to 15 cents, the gray, your profits completely disappear on the super energy-intensive materials because you built the thing expecting 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Now it's 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and you're adding huge amounts of energy input. Cobb-Douglas, the greatest flaw in economic history. Okay, the Cobb-Douglas function is what economists use to describe wealth and productivity. And it uses 2 inputs, labor and capital. Energy is ignored. So $60 worth of oil is worth $60 worth of entertainment, or $60 worth of clothing, or $60 worth of food, or $60 worth of machinery to an economist. But we already know from the previous slides that energy is vastly more important to our economies. Energy does all the work needed to combine other inputs. It cannot be substituted other than with other types of energy. So this is the standard circular economy model taught in our economics classes, that households buy goods and services, that sends a signal to the firms, they make more goods and services, and money is exchanged, and then more goods and services, and it's a circular economy. It completely ignores the source, which is mostly our fossil sunlight stores that we're pulling out of the ground, and also the sink, the pollution, the CO2, the other negative impacts. So the biggest flaw in economic theory is we don't pay for the creation nor the pollution of our most valuable input to our economies. All we do is we pay for the cost of extraction. Okay, talking about money. If we have to understand energy, what about money? The majority of money in modern economy is created by commercial banks making loans. Money creation in practice differs from some popular misconceptions. Banks do not act simply as intermediaries, lending out deposits that savers place with them, nor do they multiply up central bank money to create new loans and deposits. Whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's banking account, thereby creating new money. The reality of how money is created today differs from the description found in economics textbooks. This isn't some fringe blogger that wrote this. This is the Bank of England in a recent monetary report. So money is created from thin air. This never used to be a problem because we needed more money to give to the entrepreneurs because we had plenty of untapped resources and ideas and research. But since 1971, there's not been a single currency in the world, other than Bitcoin, with a link to physical resources. So banks do not loan money, they create it. And they create a lot of it. This is a little complicated, but somewhat important. The graph on the left, the red line, the blue shows GDP for America, and the red line shows debt added. And you can see that over time we add more and more credit just to keep GDP going. On the right graph is China. China used to have 2 credits added to get 1 unit of GDP, and recently they've had 6 units of new debt out of thin air to generate 1 unit of GDP. So debt productivity, or how much GDP we get from an additional dollar of new debt, is in decline globally. So if you think about it, big picture, energy is really our capital, our major wealth. And we have a lot of it left, but it's declining in quality. It's becoming more expensive. But money, we're creating more digitally and physically in terms of paper and such. We don't think of it this way, but when we take on debt as a nation, as a company, or as an individual, that debt someday has to be paid back with energy. And remember, at the end of the day, financial capital, money, is just a marker for real capital. Real capital is natural capital. That's a picture of my backyard, healthy ecosystems, soil, trees, rivers. Social capital, our friends, our networks. This is a picture of my dog. Built capital, this is my house. There's chainsaws, there's some solar panels, there's an aloe vera plant, there's a barbecue grill. And human capital, our skills, our knowledge, our health. That's me identifying an edible mushroom, and that's my dad growing vegetables and complaining about it. So we don't think about it, but most people in our world view things from a monetary lens. But our economy, quite simply, is how fast we can extract fossil sunlight and burn through it in terms of getting immediate neurotransmitters, feelings, and stuff. I mean, it's more detailed than that, but that's a reasonable summary. And another summary way of putting it is, we have an economy based on stocks, but we think we have an economy based on flows. So this is a graph I got from Tad. Our society views the world solely through a monetary lens. The monetary lens is the black line, where we really have an economy based on the red line, which is a Gaussian curve. I guess I could just use this. Does this work? Hello. Can you hear me? All right. We'll try this. Right? Should we try that? Okay. So I'll just put this aside. So the red curve is a Gaussian curve, which is cycles in nature end up looking like that, and they reach a peak and decline. And the green curve is more of a renewable flow. How much of our resources can be, how much of our economies are sustainable and stable. Okay, technology, relevant to many of you here. The problem is I have the biggest head of any of your speakers. Okay. Click it more? Okay. This doesn't count towards my time. All right? That feels better. Thank you. Okay, so there's 2 general types of technology. Technology 1 is how we improve the resource use, like a power plant would use the same amount of coal to generate more electricity. Or a new development in technology, geothermal, or a solar panel cell that's more efficient. But the other type of technology is the vast majority of technology, which is things that replace what humans used to do, like a chainsaw replaces people chopping trees manually. And then new resource conversions, like Facebook, and things like that we never had in our ancestral past. The vast majority of technology is this type 2, which ends up growing demand globally for more primary energy. Even digital consumption requires energy, and it's increasing rapidly. You say, oh yeah, but I just use Facebook and I do things online, so I'm not using a lot of energy. The short thing here is the internet, with our consumer devices, the data centers, and the creation of the items is almost 13% of our electricity right now, on the way to 15%. And finally, and I won't get into this because this should be known to many of you, but we've used a large percentage of our fossil stocks. There are plenty left, but they're going to be more costly, which means, because of that price dynamic I showed, lower benefits to society. This is a complicated graph. Just look at the red line. Basically, in America, the cost of extracting oil has gone up almost 400% since the year 2000. And there's a very important difference between the price of oil, which is what we pay at the pump, and the cost of oil, which is what the oil companies pay, and the value of oil. The value of oil to a human 200 years from now, looking back to today, is amazing. And a personal side note, we're wasting most of it. Okay, that's the energy basics. Deep breath. I think my thing is attached now. So now let's talk about the superorganism. So there's something in nature called the maximum power principle, maximum entropy production principle, which states that organisms and ecosystems in nature self-organize so as to better access an energy gradient. So a tree will grow its leaves and branches to maximize the surface area of the leaves to have, for photosynthesis, access to sunlight. If you take an airplane and do a thermal test on a forest area like this, the coolest areas will be the oldest growth trees because they're degrading the most sunlight. The hottest areas will be the areas where nothing is living, like the path. Okay. Human behavior. I have a whole month of my class on human behavior. Now I'm going to tell you a story in 4 minutes. So our minds can look forward, but our feelings come from what worked in the past. So ultrasociality is a term that refers to how tribal and how social we are as a species. We're not individual soul hunters like a jaguar. We are community-based. We care what other people think. We cooperate towards larger goals. We're incredibly social. So if you think about, for 290,000 years of our species history, we were hunter-gatherers roaming around. And about 12,000 years ago, because the climate changed 7 places around the world, we started agriculture. We started staying in place. We started generating surplus in the form of grain. And then a couple hundred years ago, conveniently or not, coal, oil, and gas fossil helpers walked out of the ground and entered our economies. That changed the whole conversation of surplus. So if you think about nature, sexual selection and relative fitness is a huge driver. The same way that a peacock flashes its tails to a female peacock, this picture on the right is Tiger Woods' yacht and his ex-wife's new boyfriend's yacht. And you laugh because you know, even in your own lives, you see this behavior. Here was an economics test. Would you prefer a 4,000 square foot house where all your neighbors were 6,000 square foot? Or would you prefer a 3,000 square foot house where all your neighbors' houses were smaller, 2,000 square feet? The vast majority of people would prefer a smaller house as long as it's bigger than their neighbors. And this is a core driver of human behavior. We think we need more than we actually do because we look around at what other people are doing and we want to be at least as successful as them. So we spend an inordinate amount of time focusing on relative instead of how unbelievably absolute rich we are right now relative to probably our ancestors and our descendants. Another problem is the wanting of something feels stronger in our brains than the having. I recognize this. I used to manage money for billionaires on Wall Street, and these guys had $1 billion, and they just wanted to get to $2 billion, and they were going to quit and buy an island and just quit. But then their friends were making money along the same while, and every day they had to get the feeling of making more. They were after the feeling, not the actual thing. So we get the signal where we want to buy something like a car or some new shoes, and then we think about it, and then we actually buy it, and we do some effort, and that's where the dopamine, the pleasing brain feeling, hits us. But then when we actually buy it, it's downhill from there. We show a couple of our friends, we brag about it for a while, and 2 weeks later, we need to get that feeling again from something else. So if we think about the way we're wired, the agenda of the gene, think about this short checklist. Temperature, would you rather it be 10 degrees, 65, or 110? Well, you want to be 65, most people. Do you want to be wealthy or poor? you want 0 children, greater than 0? Would you prefer a newspaper, dial-up, or broadband? Do you prefer to be miserable or comfortable? Need to be in Jeddah in 2 hours? Do you want to drive a car or walk? Prefer to win wars or lose wars? Care more about how your life is this year or in 10 years? Prefer to be viewed as more or less successful than your neighbor? If you think about these choices, these human preferences, virtually all of them have one thing in common, is they're correlated with more energy needs. You in Saudi Arabia need air conditioning. Where I live in Minnesota right now, we have heat. Both are uses of energy to make us more comfortable. So if we think about the human animal, we seek physical homeostasis, almost all of which requires energy. However, most psychological needs in our culture still require more energy, but don't have to. And finally, as biological animals, we heavily weight the present over the future. We care way much more about the next 3 days than the next 3 years. And we care way more about the next 3 hours than the next 3 days. So in thermodynamic terms, power is energy used per unit time, and the brain has a similar dynamic. It's not so much energy, but it's experiences. We want brain services, we want them today, not next week, not next year, or next decade. Okay, so how does this all fit together? You all have probably seen graphs like this. This is a total energy consumption the last 200 years globally. The beige on the bottom is biomass, trees mostly. Then coal, then the green is oil, the red is natural gas, then nuclear, hydro, and some renewables. Pretty much with a few recessions and bumps, we've continued to grow the size of the energy spigot. So up until the 1970s, this energy spigot, we continued our physical world expansion. We added vertical land productivity, which is fossil fuels, to previous horizontal productivity, which was farming. And then we ran into 2 energy crises in the 70s. The next stage was debt and trade productivity. In order to keep access to this energy spigot growing, we went to 1, debt as a way of pulling resources forward in time, and 2, we went to globalization, a global market economy as a way to access cheaper areas of production and more cooperation. This model hit a wall in the great financial crisis in 2008. Then we entered the central bank and government guarantee era. Since 2008, central banks and governments responded with temporary, which are still going, too big to fail guarantees, quantitative easing, artificially low interest rates, balance sheet expansion in order to maintain our population's access to energy. And now what's happening is what I refer to as Orwellian productivity. There's rule changes. Italy made prostitution and cocaine sales part of GDP in order to stay under the ECB debt to GDP ratio. They could still have their debt guaranteed. New tax and benefit schemes and numerous other abstractions allow us to continue growing this energy spigot, but for how long? Okay, this next piece is a model I'm working on. I'm going to go through it real fast to save time. But if you imagine the size of the human energy use as a straw, and then we take a cross-section of the straw, there's things that cause the straw to grow. Okay, the low cost of energy is a big one. That type 2 technology, which is the making things more efficient or finding new energy sources, that historically was a big one. And then we also have government rules and money. So 20, 30 years ago, it was mostly the low-cost energy and this type 1 technology that would grow the energy spigot. But in order to keep it growing, we are increasingly using less sustainable ways of growing this energy spigot. We're creating money from thin air. We're making government rule changes, and we're developing all kinds of gadgetry and things that require a greater demand for energy but aren't really paying it back. So there's a push of the global economy, which is cheap energy, and there's a pull, which is creating money to pull the system forward. They're equivalent in their effect in the short term, but in the long term, they're not equivalent. So just as an example, this is hypothetical, these aren't real numbers, but access to credit globally will change the shape of global oil production. With no debt, it's just kind of a normal curve, a Gaussian distribution. With access to debt, we get a lot more out, but at eventually a steeper decline rate for various reasons. We also find some new stuff that we wouldn't have found before, so it's not a total negative, but it changes the shape. So basically, the cross-section now is we're using things that are less sustainable to keep it going. So the outputs of the superorganism are energy-based, and the inputs increasingly are non-caloric, based on human rule changes, et cetera. So coming back to this tree, if we think about the maximum power principle in nature, it also applies to human systems. This is a picture of Cape Canaveral, Florida. The net result of 7.5 billion humans, each as evolved animals pursuing this optimal foraging theory, want a higher return the same way a cheetah would pursue a gazelle. We cooperate, assemble in groups, corporations, and nations, is an energy-hungry superorganism. And it could be Fort Lauderdale, or Jeddah, or Beijing, or Taipei, or Bombay, or the world over is kind of self-organizing towards these energy dissipative structures. So this puzzle I had at the beginning starts to take a shape, and our species, in my opinion, is de facto functioning as a superorganism beyond our individual control. And this has two main inferences, and I'll follow with implications. Naturally, we assume that bigger, larger, more people is more able to grasp, envision, and plan for complex events. A single human cell, a kidney, a person, a small group of people, a large group like Congress, a nation of humans, a world of 8 billion. We figure that we give more information to people above us in the hierarchy and better decisions will be made. It's not true. It doesn't work that way. There's a maximum based on our tribal past that individuals in small groups are best able to parse and understand things. Large groups, behaviorally, global human society functions using simple tropisms, akin to a simple amoeba sloughing forward. All it's wanting is energy. AKA, the larger the group of people, the dumber it gets with respect to complex plans. So thinking does not happen outside an individual brain. So it's kind of depressing when you first think about this, but there is no secret society, there is no great president of the world or groups of presidents that actually have a plan. The game is the plan. Quarterly earnings is the plan. And that leads to my second point. Physically, global human society is functioning as an energy dissipating structure. We call it GDP, but to all first approximations, we could call it GDB, gross domestic burning, because every product, every cup, every slide projector, every shoe, every product that you guys have bought in the last week, somewhere on Earth there was a little fire that contributed to creating it. Okay, downstream of the superorganism. I don't have time to get into the environmental situation, but I must mention it because it's critical to understanding the story. Since I've been alive in the late 1960s, we've lost half of the animals on Earth. Our livestock and our human population, if you put them on a scale, they outweigh the remaining terrestrial wild animals 50 to 1. There's pollution 5 miles under the ocean in the Marianas Trench, the same amount as there are in Chinese rivers. There's a significant mass extinction going on now before ocean acidification and climate issues really are happening. So this is something out of our sight, out of our minds, but it's happening and it's important. Okay, so the synthesis, how does this all fit together? The main implications of superorgonomics, as I term it. The human amoeba, the superorganism, is the invisible hand of the market. Corporations, nations, people, small groups, we are maximizing our profits collectively, and this adds up to this force that is propelling our global system forward and ignoring all these warnings, ignoring the environmental warnings, because we're focused just on the next 3 months. So if we look back to the trophic pyramid of our ancestors, that's now changed. And now it's in the little circle off to the bottom, we have this kind of misshapen trophic pyramid where we've used half, plus or minus, of the real low entropy energy. We've turned it into a lot of goods and services, but increasingly more services. In my country, we now have more bartenders and waitresses than we have manufacturing employees. And we have this bloated financial system on top representing all things underneath. And it's bloated because we have all these guarantees that basically no one can lose money because the central banks have their backs. So what's interesting here is a global culture. Humans are no longer maximizing surplus, but surplus value. In other words, digital representations of surplus. So long-term growth was not the norm. This is a chart of the last 2,000 years. We had a couple of very long periods without growth, but all of our economic theories were invented in that red box era. So economic theory wasn't chosen because it was true or valid. It was chosen, used in the service of this dissipative structure. So when economic theory was invented, we were in this blue circle time, and the black line and the red line were right on top of each other. There was no shortage of energy. There wasn't a shortage of anything. So we made these observations that were accurate at the time, but for the wrong reasons. Now we're kind of in this red area of the black curve. All key decision makers in our world are expecting the black line because of a flawed Cobb-Douglas and a monetary as opposed to an energy lens. There's no credible institution or government body or corporation globally that is specifically planning for an end to growth, despite growth being over in terms of income for 80% of developed world population. So politically, our system is not broken, actually, but working perfectly. Moving away from the rich feeding grounds of fossil sunlight productivity is not in the job description of high-status humans. Okay, getting to technology. I have a few points to make about technology. This is an important one. As long as human cultures maximize GDP, which is what we're all doing now, efficiency and better technology is merely going to build a larger global heat engine. So this shows fossil fuels, nuclear, hydro versus renewables as they pertain to electricity over the last 30 years. Now what's interesting is the graph on the right shows very high growth rates in renewables. But if you take the total, instead of the growth rate, you look at the absolute, it's the one on the right compares to the one on the left. Gas, oil, coal is growing on an absolute basis much, much larger. So growing renewables in the current culture will likely just build an aggregate heat engine. So the other problem with technology, the blue line is in America, the percent change in real income. And you can see since the middle 70s, the bottom 90% of Americans are about the same, and most of the profits have been concentrated at the top. So the owners of capital, the owners of the robots, as it were, are getting most of the profits. And this is a problem in the future as we increasingly substitute human labor for mechanical labor under current trends. It's going to impoverish a higher number of humans. So here's a little sidebar, relevant to the theme of this conference. Most technology is just leading to a higher global demand for primary energy. When primary energy begins to decline, technology is going to have to do much more, or we're going to have to do with less. As robots increasingly become cheaper than human workers, we'll have to reconsider the relationship between jobs and work, and also what to do with all those who were replaced by robots. All those truck drivers or baristas or taxi drivers, if they don't have jobs, what are they going to do? If enough people drop back to poverty levels, who are going to buy these tech products? Number three, there's a difference between being technologically possible and technologically affordable and scalable. If we think about flying cars, we're probably going to have flying cars, but is everyone going to have flying cars? Not at the declining benefit trajectory that I talked about. Most modern time-saving tech devices give us more time to play games and waste time. And importantly, technology, especially smartphones, internet, social media, are shortening our attention spans, especially with young people, making our citizens less capable of making complex long-term tasks in the future. A lot of 19-year-olds are so addicted to social media, they can't even read a book. I'm sure it's the same here as it is in America. Well, actually, I'm not sure. Maybe it's not. But in Europe, it is. The mass extinction and metabolic impacts on biogeochemistry are downstream of the superorganism. We can't just say, hey, let's leave the carbon in the ground and do what's right for the climate. We can't do that because we need the carbon to grow our economies. The main way we're accessing energy today is via the credit markets. This chart shows the blue line is GDP, and the red line is how much GDP growth every year, and the red line is how much we grew our credit every year. And so in order to keep things going, we're going into more debt. So as long as we can increase credit, we'll continue to grow. When we can't, we won't.
This shows global credit growth from 2002 to 2007 to 2012 to 2017. China is the red. China's been a big component of the growth in credit. But we've grown our credit globally from 89 trillion in 2002 to 217 trillion last year. Over the same time, we grew our economy from 50 trillion to 75 trillion. So we're growing more and more debt just to keep the economy going a little bit. So what we're doing with all this stuff is we're using these non-sustainable parts of the straw to kick the can further down the road until it's blocking the road. And then we have to think about it. So in my opinion, from the lens of the superorganism, we're going to keep growing until we run out of food. And food could be energy, but it could be money, it could be any of these things that expand the straw. And then we're going to have to respond to what I term the great simplification. A reduction of advanced economies' GDP is now unavoidable once we remove low productivity debt additions, once we shift towards lower productivity, more costly energy and resources, and with the return of solar inputs, renewables. So we talk about self-driving Uber cars and wind and things like that. We can have a very large economy like now with a decent amount of renewables and a smaller economy powered in good part by renewables. But what we can't have is a larger economy powered mainly by renewables. So this gets back to the virtual versus the physical world question. Okay, conclusions and implications. So this is our situation. We have an economy based largely on fossil sunlight, and half of it's gone. Not only that, but we've used up a large majority of our environmental sinks in the oceans, in the atmosphere, and with other species. But we're still using this game plan where we think it's our cleverness and our technology and our ingenuity that are powering the economy. We don't even realize about this bank account other than we know oil is important because we need it for gasoline. And we don't even include the prices of these externalities in our market system. So this graph represents time on the lower axis and energy cost on the left axis. And what's happening is the extraction costs globally of our most important resources are going up. And what's happening is consumers' affordability and their ability to pay for things is going down. So it's these two trends that are going to intervene in coming decades. So if we think about the implications of that, is extremely energy-intensive applications are going to get more expensive in coming decades. And the other problem is the lowest quintiles of income in most OECD countries have been significantly declining. So this is the lowest 20% of Americans based on income are down. They've lost 12% of their income over the last decade. Only the top 5% of Americans are making more than a decade ago. 95% of Americans, and the same thing in Europe. I have no idea about other countries because I haven't studied them. But most developed countries are facing this trend. So again, reality for 90% of people in USA and Europe, growth is already over, yet all governments continue to plan for growth. This is the IMF World GDP Forecast. No matter how much we miss on the estimates, they continue to project growth into the future. So what's happening seems like somebody's fault. We're tribal. We like to blame when something happens. It's the Russians, it's the liberals, it's the Republicans, it's the tree huggers, it's the rich, it's some other demographic. But the real story is that our fossil helpers are asking for pay raises at a time when the amoeba is larger and hungrier. Viewed from the perspective of the superorganism, we're all complicit, but no one is to blame. So the good news is our physical needs require energy. Most psychological needs do not. After the superorganism becomes smaller, there will be new models about how humans receive our brain services. But we have to understand who we are first. This is a Vaclav-Smil's graph that shows energy supply on the bottom axis versus human development. And you can see is countries that have very low energy supply are very poor and don't have a lot of development. And then once they get to a basic amount, then it levels off. And this we could see many times in our own lives and in countries' lives, that at a certain point, more money or more energy doesn't make us more happier. Here's a few countries, for example. Guatemala, the average person in Guatemala makes $7,700 a year. The average person in Kuwait makes $70,000 a year. They're equally happy in both of those countries, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Here's the average income over a 50-year period in the United States, increasing pretty much every year, versus a chart of very happy people. Not correlated. Some of you are smiling and laughing because you know this is true. You know that more stuff isn't what gets us happiness. It's social capital and meaning, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. So we think about the big picture, like thousands of years before and after, and we are living through the carbon pulse. And for those of you that are concerned about climate change, you hope we're at the top star. And for those of you who are worried about the economy, you hope we're still at the bottom star. My opinion is the economic inputs to the worst climate models are delusional because they have economists running them. And fossil fuels will quit before we fire them. But will that suffice, and will the cure unprepared for be worse? I don't know. Okay, brief summary. Energy is what we have to budget and spend. Money is just a marker for real capital and wealth. The primary drivers of growth, cheap energy, and available credit are waning. For most people in developed worlds, growth is already over. We do not face a resource scarcity situation. There's plenty of resources, but instead one of declining resource contribution. What benefits does that more expensive resource give to our economies? Less than we're expecting. In other words, there isn't a real energy shortage, but rather a longage of expectations. Our evolved behavior drivers make it difficult to plan ahead other than in crisis. Biology determines what we need. Culture determines how we get it. The global market-based human society is functioning as a dissipative structure and will continue to do so until it can't. We need to, as best as we can, use intelligent foresight and integrate plan for a lower consumption, more local and regional future. The good news is we only need a fraction of all this material stuff to be happy and healthy. Okay, the challenge of this century, what do? I don't know. And I also don't know what the future will be. I'm pretty confident I know what it will not be. But the future is a probability distribution, and each of you have a distribution in your head of what it looks like, and what is possible and what will happen is going to change perhaps daily. What's not likely to happen is growing the economy and mitigating climate change. What's not likely to happen is growing the economy by replacing fossil fuels with renewables. Humans en masse choosing to leave fossil sunlight in the ground. Governments explaining a presentation like this before limits are well passed. So what to do as a world species? Quite simply, we need a completely different conversation of how all this stuff fits together. What to do as a species? Ask better questions. What is our goal? What are the stakes? How can we use the remaining oil and gas towards best purposes so 200 years from now our descendants don't look back and say it was all wasted? Does knowing who we are, where we came from, what we're doing, what we need and want, what is possible matter? That is a very important question. I like to think it does matter. What to do as a nation or institution? Educate people on ecology and natural resources at a young age. Consider taxing resources instead of labor. Start pilots of residences without baseload and try out lower consumption lifestyle patterns. Direct resources to support science and unbiased journalism media. Redefine poverty and provide safety nets for the lower tranches of society. Consider an anti-rebound effect pool where we don't fall into this energy tech rebound effect and we take profits from new efficiency and technology and we don't feed them back to the amoeba, but we direct them towards some more sustainable plan. We break large groups working on better futures into smaller subsets. For example, take 500 people working on an issue, divide the funding up into 100 piles, and give it to those 100 groups of 5 people. Because we function best in small groups, not as a superorganism. What to do as a university college? Educate and train students in subjects and skills that will be needed in a source sink constrained future. Have science and technology directed towards providing basic human needs. The problem is there isn't funding for this yet in most schools. Build new interdisciplinary collaborative capacity. Suggest maybe retiring professors consider a pro-future capstone project during their last 3 years at college. We need detailed expertise and continued specialization, but perhaps the academy can stop rewarding hyper-specialization associated with such reductionism. Make your school needed and relevant because much of our university system is a product of surplus, which is going away. This university has amazing opportunity because You are incredibly well funded. You're all scientists. You're dealing with energy and materials and stuff. And you're in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most energy-rich places on the planet. You could do special things here at this school. Be bold and take risks. A highly educated, disciplined mind is a terrible thing to waste. These are unique times. Okay, what to do as individuals? I'll close with a few slides on this. The simplest changes. Use logic, reason, and think for yourself, and avoid the consensus trance. Become woke to the huge advantage you have in life because you understand these things. You're one of the, unfortunately, very few. Try to accept you cannot shift things too much before the energy economy reality becomes more apparent to everyone. Don't step out of society, live a normal life, advance in a job you like in today's world, but recognize it will likely change at some point. And consider being a sleeper, leader, anchor for the future. Be ready to engage when the world needs your knowledge. From an energy economy perspective, consider simplifying first and beating the rush. Don't become overly reliant on energy-intensive activities and lifestyles. Help to relocalize, re-regionalize supply chains. Learn a physical skill. Help to design technology that provides important basic human services as opposed to short-term dopamine novelty. Contribute to a massive list of societal transition projects and campaigns tackling pieces of the challenge. From a brain behavior perspective, get to know your brain, and that may be a little uncomfortable because we very rarely have conversations with ourselves. Be happy with absolute wealth instead of relative. Consider a paleo behavior diet, just as the same as a diet that eating nuts and meats and not carbs or fats or alcohol is healthy for our bodies. A paleo behavior diet, the way that we used to live, might periodically make you healthier. Take electricity technology breaks. Reset your brain and nature. Choose your tribe wisely. Who you hang around with makes an immense difference on your life satisfaction. Relax, smile, enjoy life, and be kind to yourself. That's important. Finally, you might consider having a conversation with yourself on these issues. Who am I being alive at this time with these challenges? What do I stand for? The time is not to minimize my impact, but to maximize it. How can I do that? And I think this is very important. We look at what we're doing to the planet, and we're looking at this gargantuan challenge, and it's natural to say that humans are evil, that we're bad. And I don't believe that's the case. I think what we're doing has an evil component to it, but we're just executing the algorithms that our ancestors gave us, and we're born during this time. So we're not evil at all. We're amazing creatures capable of great things, both terrible and wonderful. And we are part of the superorganism, and you are not. You have degrees of freedom outside of the story that I've told. So we live in very special times. To conclude, our world is not yet fully broken. What is our species, Homo sapiens, capable of? Brain services per non-renewable resource input is going to be a key metric this century. Knowing who we are and what is at stake is the first step. Caring is the second, then there are more. We're each part of an energy-hungry global amoeba, and we are not. Thank you. And I guess we have questions that I'm supposed to throw this box around.
Let's just throw it in immediately.
Throw it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Thomas, he's good at catching.
Hey.
Okay,
nice.
okay, guys, there's time for a few questions, and please do not think that you're depressed because you shouldn't be. It is also, you know, it takes a whole semester of heavy work, as some of the students present here will attest to really kind of digest, understand this issue. So you are hit over the head, and probably you are now kind of trying to digest it. So don't be afraid, ask a few tough questions, and we'll go ahead with the show.
And I'm giving a talk tomorrow.
Oh, and Nate will be giving a talk tomorrow on a different subject after my lecture, so you're going to have it up to here, in the auditorium linking buildings 4 and 5. I hope that I'm right. Okay. So with that, should we ask the first question?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It was nice. I was awake all the time. Sure. My question is about the booming in incremental of populations. Is there any scientific study about the limitation of resources on the earth and growing number of human in the globe?
There's considerable research on what populations are sustainable, but the critical level is what those populations would be consuming. The Earth could probably handle 10, 12 billion people if we were living like people like in Costa Rica. We could not handle 10 or 12 billion Saudi Arabians or Americans at our energy levels. It also depends how you define sustainable. How much of the non-human sphere are we taking in to our system? I think Tad probably knows this better than I do. The best estimates I've seen are, plus or minus 2 billion without fossil fuels, but we have a lot of fossil fuels left. So it's a difficult question, but one that immediately comes to most people's minds. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I would only add one thing, that out of 7.6 billion people, 5.6 billion people owe their lives to the nitrogen fertilizer, to better, purer water, and to antibiotics, and to the essentially transfer of the ecosphere into the human sphere, which is liquidation of resources. We are now at a time where the liquidation of resources can no longer proceed at the previous pace. So I would say 2 to 3 billion people would be a very reasonable guess.
Back here, there's someone. And oh, what's her name?
Don't worry, you get the second chance in the back.
Yes.
Right here. Thank you very much for the lecture. And one of the recommendations you had at the very end was to learn a physical skill. Could you please elaborate on that and why?
Well, we're conditioned naturally to expect the future to be like the past. And most people don't even know where food comes from. We go to the grocery store and we buy these little packages that are neatly arrived. And so we become hyper-focused on just being a computer expert. We have become a society of uber experts, and we used to be a society of generalists. 20,000 years ago, our brains were 20% larger, and we've kind of outsourced a lot of our generalist attributes to the cloud because we have this giant cooperative society. But if we simplify and we have less benefits from fossil fuels, which is my prediction, you may be the only one in your neighborhood that knows how to grow potatoes, or that knows how to fix a lawnmower, or that can repair a shoe, or something like that, that you have an advantage to your group. I'm not saying you have to learn everything, just choose one thing that you're kind of interested in that would be helpful to a community, and just learn that over time. I think it would be a good advice. I know how to grow potatoes and chop wood and sing. That's about it, but I'm trying to learn other things. There was a question back here, and I don't know where the...
Hello?
Yes,
hi.
yes, hi.
Thanks for the talk. I want to ask, so do you think capitalism and its focus on growth, profit, and moving all human activity to the market is responsible for the kind of superorganism we are today? And do you think we could have had a different reality if we had a different social system in place?
Excellent question. My own belief is that the superorganism chose capitalism in order to grow. It was the thing that accelerated. I almost think that what's happening now led us to this exact moment here in this room, where we're kind of starting to see the whole picture. And we had to do this and figure all this out and go down this path to realize where we went wrong. Now, clearly, 200 years, if we could go back 200 years ago, would we have developed coal, oil, natural gas? Would we have had the population increase? Would we have done the things that we did? Knowing what we do now, no, I don't think we would have. But I think what happened is unavoidable. What is not unavoidable is how we react to the great simplification. Capitalism is, there's many forms of capitalism. The one that's happening now in my country is one of the worst, because we're just funneling all the money and the status and the resources to the top 1%, And most people are really anxious and worried, and the environment is suffering. And there are other forms of capitalism. Norway and Denmark and Canada are a little bit different. So I don't really know, but that's my guess. Yes?
Thank you very much. On one of your slides, you showed that a message that robots becoming more and more cheap, and
sorry, what?
Robots,
yeah,
become more and more cheap and more efficient than humans. So in future, it may result that robots will substitute more and more humans, and humans will become jobless more and more. So can you please comment a little bit what will happen in education in that case? Because education should be affected. How do people need to be educated in the future if they see that robots are substituting them?
That's an excellent question that I've never thought about. I'll be honest, I think our education system is also a bubble right now. We are, I don't think this school is, because what you're learning here is science and technology that are applicable to the world. But a lot of the classes at my university are kind of trivia. They're not really relevant to the student's future. So I think our education system has to continue with science and technology, and also with some art and history, but also with some how to grow food and applicable things to people's lives, especially with what you say about the robots. I mean, if the robots really do take over half of our jobs, then the university system is going to deplete faster than oil. My quick answer. Yes.
Hello, thanks for the talk. Could you first make the slides available somehow for people who maybe couldn't follow the speaker?
Yeah, sorry, I had to talk so fast. The slides will be available, and also this was filmed and it will be online. You could watch it in slow motion if you really want to.
Reading, thinking, and listening at the same time. And the second question, would you describe yourself as someone of the post-growth community? It's a growing community of thinkers who try to formulate how we're going to go forward from here. And if yes, would you recommend any books or thinkers of this community?
So I make around $50,000 a year now, which is a tenth of what I used to make. And I blew through all my money from Wall Street. So I don't have much money in the bank. As an American, I'm relatively poor, although my house is paid for, so I'm in good shape. I'm fabulously rich, considering other humans on the planet and in our history. But making far less than I used to make, I've never been happier in my life, because I get paid in things other than dollars. I get paid for right now educating you in these questions and interacting with other people on things that matter. I get paid from my students' smiles and understanding on these things. So in that sense, I'm no longer growing, although I still am this way, but my bank account is flat. So yes, in that sense, I am part of the post-growth economy. Another point I'd like to make is there is a degrowth movement out there that want to consciously degrow our economies. Like, we're going to vote to degrow. I don't think that'll ever happen. Based on the premise of this, we're going to continue to grow until we can't, and then the superorganism is going to degrow for us. And how do we respond to that is going to be the question. So I will somehow get to TAD a list of resources. I've written a book, 2 books for my students called A Guide to Being Human in the 21st Century. They will be publicly available in the next few months, and it goes through all aspects of this, including a 60-page what to do section. It'll be free to the public, so I'll make that available somehow. Yes? And then there's a question here and here next.
Okay. Thank you for the talk. And thank you to remind us that everything is thermodynamic. I think it's a good reminder. Yes, I have more a comment than a question. I am quite surprised that in all your presentation, you're not showing the demographic, the increase of demography and the behavior of people regarding demography. I mean, for example, the more wealthy we are, the less child we do, and not the more, you know? So it's not like anything else. And the transition doesn't seem to be driven by oil or food or anything like that. Actually, in Europe, the demographic transition started before the use of oil and ended in the peak of it. So how do you, what's your comment on that?
Yeah, richer people, especially, and women who have access to education, et cetera, end up having fewer children. The oil growth story, my story is that growth is what's being optimized. And these demographic transitions of how many children are being having have a lot to do with cultural and other things. It's not just oil, but oil is going to be the story over the next 30, 40 years, is what I meant. And yeah, this story is slightly different for Norway or Germany or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or China or India or America. I know America and the global situation, so I can't really speak adequately to your question. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, we have not much time, but one comment I would make here is that the highest correlator between population growth and human behavior is the education of women and empowerment of women. So to the extent that women are better educated and empowered, they will have fewer children, regardless of their wealth. And so there's a false dichotomy saying that wealthy people having fewer children. Well, maybe so in a few nations, but in most countries, it's the more educated people who have fewer children. They don't have to be wealthy.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm Salim from FCC. My question is, I see many data analysis, historical analysis, and previous analysis. Now, are the renewable energy will challenge oil energy soon from your analysis?
Will renewable energy challenge oil really soon?
Yes.
I think no, for various reasons. Number one is, I'll speak to America, although this is similar globally. In America, 19% of our energy use is electricity, okay? So solar and wind are electric. They're not liquid fuel, et cetera. So there's all these petrochemical, plastics, other things that are non-electric. Secondly is, I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If we want to add some solar panels, it's quite cheap now. It's down to, 6, 7 cents a kilowatt hour. That's really cheap. So that makes sense to add them. But if we had to power the whole city on solar panels, that's a completely different question, because we need 24/7 access for the clean rooms and the manufacturing and all the bells and whistles, which I'm sure you're aware of. So what ends up happening is that 7 cents would be 60 or 70 cents if it had to be the full system on renewables. So renewables can power a civilization, just not this civilization. So my best bet is that renewables will continue to grow a little bit, but oil, coal, and natural gas are going to dominate because we have the infrastructure. We have $100 trillion worth of machinery that runs on diesel and gasoline. We've got the built, embedded infrastructure of this global machine that's powered on that. So I think solar and wind will continue to make inroads, but they're not going to replace, in my opinion, which I think Tad agrees with.
And in fact, in a complement to Nate's talk, I'm going to be speaking about this very issue tomorrow, 2 to 3. Okay, so I'll tell you more.
Thank you for the presentation. I was holding my breath because you were talking so much.
Yeah, sorry.
I was not feeling that you are taking enough air of the. So,
no, I'm fine. Thank you.
I was feeling that you were going to.
I have so much to say, and I have to condense it. I do the best I can. I would love to talk here for 3 hours, then I could tell the whole story. Go ahead with your question.
I appreciate it. My question was that you, in a hurry, passed through the sentence that we live in an interesting time.
Mm.
Can you elaborate more? Is it in positive, negative? And my second question is, you said that the average 19-year-old in our time cannot handle or complex. Is it my understanding?
No, I think he said that.
Because my 5-year-old son absorbs information and data, and
Yeah.
I think we all have that one through media, through his iPad.
Yeah.
Other than my generation, at that time, we had limited. So our new generation, sons, absorb information, data much higher, like a new computer, an opposite to obsolete computers.
Yeah,
Thank
so two questions. So I'll answer the second one first. My students are amazingly smart. The issues that I talked about here really could be explained to a 12-year-old, but we're not doing that. This would be too much for a 12-year-old, but the concepts could be understood by a 12-year-old. In my experience, the story that I'm telling you, there's no profit behind it. The profit that I'm trying to talk to you about is the surplus, the profit in 2050, to make sure that we have some. But there is no natural champion to do these things because it's not part of the market system. So in my experience, explaining this story, it's complex, it's abstract, it's threatening, it's in the future, and I don't have exact solutions for what to do. So a 19-year-old who's not in the workforce yet, who doesn't have a boss, who doesn't have a baby, who doesn't have a mortgage, can take this on board and understand it. Or a 70-year-old who's retired and sees what's happening in the world, they understand this stuff. And like, yeah, that's right. The people in the middle, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds, they have too much on their plate, they have too much invested in the current system to acknowledge this story. So which is why I decided to focus on 18, 19, 20-year-olds, because they will be the future leaders that have to at least, if 5% of our population understood the importance of energy, understood ecology, understood the way the human brain worked, we would have much better decisions made in the future. So that was what I meant to say about that. As far as interesting times, yeah, like the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. No, I didn't mean it really like that. I mean, it's both a perilous and a wonderful time to be alive. I'm in freaking Saudi Arabia giving this talk. I flew here on an airplane. I mean, it's amazing the things we can do right now, and it's also tragic. It's also tragic to what we're doing to the planet. We were born into this. It wasn't our fault, and now we have to take it on board and figure out how to navigate what's coming. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, sure, okay. Oh, well, last question.
Okay, thank you. You made one reference to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Do you think that that kind of currencies will be a game changer?
I don't know about Bitcoin. I think blockchain will be a game changer. I think that's the next step. I think my comments about money is why Bitcoin came into existence to begin with, because people were afraid of the monetary authorities destroying the value of currencies, so they wanted something outside of the system. Personally, I don't think the governments will ever allow Bitcoin to be tens of trillions of dollars, because then it means they've lost control of taxing and other things. But I do think as long as we have a globally connected electric digital economy, that blockchain and those digital currencies are here to stay. The problem with Bitcoin, of course, at least recently, is we always needed, I've always espoused that we want an energy-based currency because we don't have one. But Bitcoin is actually maybe going too far because it's using a lot of energy very fast. It may change. They could do the SegWit technology and reduce the terahash rates, and it might be able to use less. But the irony is that we actually need, to be sustainable, this society needs a currency that's tethered to something physical. Now, gold is just some shiny little thing, but it requires a little bit of energy to get it. Much better currency would be linking it to energy or land or things that are finite. Yeah. Okay, another last question.
Hi, Nate.
Oh,
so thank you for your talk. Yeah. I'm Frank. I'm from Clean Combustion Center. So my question is, how do you think about the biofuel in this superorganism system as you described? Because I find biofuel is something that's very similar to fossil fuel.
Biofuels is similar in its use and how we can use it, but it's very, very puny in its energy return. This is the world expert on biofuels, so you should come tomorrow and ask him that question. But if the energy return, we invest 1 barrel of oil and we get 30 or 40 out, with biofuels we invest 1 barrel of oil and we get 2 barrels of biofuels out. So the return to society is much, much smaller. So in that sense, globally scaling it to keep this superorganism growing, biofuel is not going to help. But if you're on a farm somewhere or in a region that really doesn't have access to diesel and you have a lot of rapeseed or whatever you can grow, then biodiesel is a game changer. It's absolutely critical to your local community. So it depends on the lens. You want to say anything to that? No. Okay. It's the scale. Thank you so much.
Well, let's thank Nate. And since you have to carry some weight on this airplane back,